Suit up, strap in, warm the tires, and leave on yellow. Time for the MitsuTimes podcast, presented by MitsuTimes.org, the home of the fastest Mitsubishi cars. With your host, Josh.
Hey guys, what's going on? It's Josh with MitsuTimes. Today my guest is Justin Zolsdorf. He is the owner and driver of the number one 3G on our 3G list. How you doing today, Justin?
I'm doing good. How are you, man?
I'm great. Obviously I love talking to everyone, but to get to talk to someone not just, not a Evo or DSM, but also someone who's number one on our list, it's awesome.
Well, I'm glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I just wanted to note, too, that there's only two 10-second 3Gs in the world, and you have one of them.
That's true.
So tell us about the setup on your car. I know you're going through some big changes. Seems like you're going a more serious route, which I love to see. So maybe you could tell us about, maybe we could talk about the setup that you're going to now, and then later on we could talk about the record-breaking setup.
Sure. Yeah, so right now it has a 3.6-liter dual overhead cam V6, which comprises of a Diamante 6G74 bottom end and 3000 GT non-turbo heads. I have the coolant manifold and intake manifolds are off of a Kia Sedona minivan, since Mitsubishi only ever offered this dual overhead cam layout through Hyundai Motor Company and some of their four-door cars and minivans. Oh. So I went through every detail in the engine. It's got a billet oil pump, 625 plus mainline. The rods are custom from Potter, and they're spec'd for 10,000 RPMs and 300 horsepower per cylinder. JE did the pistons. It's got half-inch head studs, custom cams. The list goes on. In a perfect world, I'd love to rev it out to 92 or 9300, but there's no guarantee that it'll do that in its current form. That is mated to a PPG dog box for the Evo, which is paired with Shep's strongest non-ACD transfer case. And I have an aluminum 8.8 IRS out of an Explorer in back, and everything's hooked up with drive shaft shop stuff. So the turbo is a Borg Warner S476 SXE on a symmetric T4 twin scroll hot parts kit. It runs E85 with a mechanical fuel system, and I broke it in this fall on the stock ECU, and I'm already in the process of wiring up the Haltech 2500 Elite.
Nice. That's what I love to hear.
So the chassis itself is 25.4 certified with tube subframes and control arms. I did everything myself in the whole entire car except the engine machine work. I have over 2,000 hours into the chassis by itself, closer to four into the whole car since I started this particular build 5 years ago.
Now, is this the same car?
It is the same car.
Okay. So, yep. Justin, what, the 3G being such a small percentage of the 3G owners have drag raced their car, what is it that got you into the 3G platform in the first place?
It was actually brutal luck. I bought the car. It's actually my first car, and I bought it back when I was 16. And back then, it was on a list of over 30 cars that I was looking at when I got my license. I'd been saving up for a car since I was 11, and I was checking this list of 30-some options 5 times a day on 7 different websites. So it was a really big deal for me, and I drove a few cars before the 3G, and they all ended up having cataclysmic problems. I drove a GC8, or what most people know as a Subaru 2.5 RS, from back before the WRX release.
Okay.
And it had bad head gaskets in it, so it overheated on the test drive. And the dealer, it was at this super shady dealer, side of the road type thing. And the guy was like, "Oh, I'll fix it. Just, come back in 5 days and you can take the car home." And I came back 5 days later and told him I needed to drive it again before I actually bought it. And this time I actually ended up stranded on the side of the highway, and there was steam going everywhere. And it was this whole big deal. And the guy had to come pick me and my dad up. So I didn't end up buying that. And I went out after that and drove this Nissan Sentra SER Spec V, and I really liked that car, but it had a spun rod bearing in it. So then this 3G shows up at a Subaru dealer in December on my 8 a.m. search, and I was there 6 hours later with my dad, and they told me that I couldn't drive it because they hadn't even washed it yet or inspected it or done anything at all. They'd literally just taken it in on trade that morning, and I said, well, if it's listed, then I need to drive it. So long story short, it came home with me on December 19th, 2008, and I actually almost totaled it twice that night because the tires were completely bald, and it was snowing.
Of
but,
course.
you know, I was 16 and I just got in my car, so I had to drive it. But that's how the 3G threaded the needle. It just sort of came down to luck.
Was it pretty much just bone stock then?
Yeah, back when I got it, it was pretty much stock. It had an AEM cold air intake on it and a MagnaFlow muffler. The previous owner had changed just the 3 front spark plug wires to NGK because they were blue.
The back ones are too hard.
The back ones were too hard, so he left those the way they were and spray painted the front valve cover blue without actually removing it from the car, so there was some overspray.
Beautiful.
And he'd put these breather hoses on the crossover vents for the valve covers, and then it was sitting on these Motegi MR7s that had tires on them that were way too wide for them, and it had 83K on it. Bald tires, bad brakes, and as I found out 1 month later, it had a bad clutch as well.
Of course.
The sound system had been stripped out, and there were wires everywhere, and it had this shitty dual deck with a bad radio circuit in it. But what it did have was the black TYC tails, which are like the cult worship taillight on the 3G platform, and it had these one-off crystal turn signals with these tinted overcovers on them. And the third brake light and rear wiper had been deleted by a professional body shop. So it was this really clean stock plus look before I even bought it. And to this day, I've changed almost nothing about it.
Awesome.
So it was a perfect high schooler mobile, though. I ended up driving it for 2 years on the bad clutch because I had a bad experience the day after I bought it when I had Tires Plus do an oil change, and they filled it twice. And those valve cover breathers that the previous owner had put on vomited oil all over the engine bay. And I vowed I would never let another shop work on the car again. And besides tires and an alignment, I have not. But due to the bad clutch, I've always called the car Achilles. There's always something holding it back, and that name has only become more and more fitting over the years.
So did it start life as a GT or a GTS?
GT. Okay. It is a 2000 Eclipse GT premium package federal spec car.
They didn't start the GTS till like 03, right?
Correct, yep.
Okay. So in your opinion, Justin, you've been into these cars a real long time. Why do you think there's not enough 3Gs out there being drag raced?
Well, I can boil down 3 reasons for you. And the first reason, which everybody knows, is that they're front-wheel drive and naturally aspirated from the factory. They are the red-headed stepchild of the Mitsubishi family, is what we 3Gers have always called ourselves. And while there's plenty of other popular front-wheel drive platforms out there, the fact that it is naturally aspirated front-wheel drive and linchpinned by the fact that it's a Mitsubishi is just not cool to own one. It has no culture to fall back on because it's not a DSM, and almost every other popular Mitsubishi came with a turbo and all-wheel drive. So you don't get those two things with the 3G, and the popularity was just never there. Even today, if I roll up to a meet with my car with a turbo and all-wheel drive, my 3G is still not as cool as an Evo, a DSM, or even a 3000 GT in the eyes of the public. And that just means it doesn't show up on the radar for most enthusiasts, and it loses the numbers game. Motivated builders don't even know the car exists. The second reason is that back in the 2000s, when the 3G was new, and it actually was a very popular platform back then, there was a small handful of companies that offered forced induction kits for the car that were absolutely garbage from an engineering standpoint.
Gotcha.
On top of that, the tuning solutions that these companies offered for these kits straight up didn't work. and a lot of motors blew up just because the tune wasn't being controlled. So you had people using these piggybacks that created huge field trims. Some of them even fed the wrong type of MAF signal to the ECU and used sensors that were in the wrong places, and they tried to compensate for it all with these rising rate fuel pressure regulators. And all it really accomplished was this rumor that the 6G72 is only good for 300 horsepower, when in reality, on E85, you could very easily make 500 wheel with a completely stock and open motor with a good kit and a good tune. Even today, I continue to tune a bunch of these old systems because they float around on the used market and offer a bolt-on solution. And the cycle with them is always the same. It starts with guys coming to me wanting a tune, and I have to walk them through, reinstalling a draw-through setup with a recirculated blow-off valve. And then they're always shocked when their RIP supercharger only makes 240 wheel horsepower, because back in the day they were advertised at more, not realizing that the people who ran them back in the day made even less, and only then, if they were lucky enough to get a full pull at all, then before they even really get to enjoy the car, the shaft bearings crap out, and they end up parting the car over it. So that's how crappy these kits were, and how these companies sort of sunk the ship from the get-go. So even these days, if you go on some of the Facebook pages, you'll see guys in there talking about how the 3 liter is only good for 300 horsepower when it's really good for a whole lot more than that.
Wow.
The last reason is actually the design failures of the car, and that's that the 3G, while it is lighter than a lot of other sports cars today, it is heavy by comparison to like the Civic. The lack of aftermarket support means that changing that is almost impossible for the average guy. So short of taking a Sawzall to it, most guys are stuck with a 3,000-pound curb weight, and in front-wheel drive land, that's just sort of a problem.
Yeah.
The other reason, and it is the 3G's true Achilles heel, if you will, is the differential. I can't think of another platform out there that comes to mind that can even hold a candle to the 3G as far as fragile stock drivetrains go. The 4-cylinder transmissions are incredibly weak. They live short lives, over 250 horsepower. That's why you don't see a bunch of 4-cylinders running around despite the support for the 4G6 engine.
Okay.
The V6s, however, they share a gear set with the Evo. The manuals do anyway. And it's an exceptionally strong transmission in the stock transmission world, but the front-wheel drive diff that comes in the 3G breaks at stock power levels. The spider gears have really open backlash and a really terrible tooth profile, and as a result, if you put headers and an intake on your 3-liter and go beat on it hard enough, you eventually break them. So if you want to hasten the process, throw a ceramic clutch in it. I helped a guy put a spec stage 3 into his car once, and he blew the differential up on his first drive.
Wow.
So it's just unreal how bad they are, and the need for a limited slip differential is just a huge barrier for most people when they're just getting started.
Right.
The sad thing is the V6 manual trans will pretty easily hold 700 for quite a while once you have that wave tracker, that quife in there. But it's that initial cost of entry. So there are definitely other reasons, but those are my 3 biggest factors in my opinion.
It's definitely a big undertaking too to swap that differential out.
Yep. Yeah, dropping the trans and cracking it open is your new gearhead's probably going to want to put a cold air intake on before he goes and tries that.
Yeah, for sure. So, Justin, tell us about the setup when the car ran the 10279 at 137.
Well, believe it or not, 10.2 was an accident. Long story short, I have built and parted the car a number of times, and the last time I decided to put it back together, I built this 3.6 liter 6G74. It was a purebred Diamante motor, and my goal was to make 500 front wheel horsepower and then move on with my life. I was pretty burned out on the platform. It was a basic piston rod motor with a set of custom cams I'd been working on for a while, and this was all the way back in 2013. Another long story short is it sailed past that goal with such flamboyant ease that it just didn't take much to keep going with it, so I did. Originally, it had a 67 millimeter Turbolab hull set on it, a T3 single scroll kit, E85 stock ECU that I tuned, stock trans of the quife, urethane bushings throughout the whole car because I have a vendetta against rubber bushings, coilovers, Evo Brembos, and it was 100% full weight minus the air conditioning. After bigger injectors and more fuel pump and 25 pounds of boost, I was melting fourth gear going down the highway. So I said, okay, I need to revisit this all-wheel drive thing since traction was really the only thing keeping it from being a pretty awesome car.
Yeah.
So I ended up making my first all-wheel drive adapter plate in the screen porch attached to the back of my parents' house with hand tools. And looking back on this, it makes my skin crawl just thinking about the tolerances I must have had. But I then converted the car to all-wheel drive in a one-slot garage that had one outlet and no lights, and the snowball just rolled faster and faster and faster. Because once you can hook 500 in first, you just want more.
Yeah, for sure.
And more and more and more. So then it was bigger turbo, more fuel, better ignition, and I was street racing this thing 4 or 5 days a week if the temperatures were above freezing. I'm talking hundreds and hundreds of launches. It was so addicting to dunk on every platform under the sun with a 3G Eclipse, especially from a dig. I had so much fun with it, but eventually it killed a transfer case. So the first weekend of May 2017, literally the night before I was going to go to the track. So instead of that, I spent pretty much all of 2017 redoing the all-wheel drive kit, redoing the turbo kit, and all this while waiting on the replacement transfer case, which was another long story. So on October 8th, 2017, I trailered the car to the track with a completely new setup. I'd broken it in and tuned it, but nothing else. I'd never launched it, never raced it. It was that same 3.6, but now it had a Borg Warner S369 SXE on it with a T4 twin scroll hot parts kit. It had a built Evo 8 synchro trans, another built non-ACD transfer case that I had pitted the ring and pinion in during tuning, and a 2G open rear diff that I'd thrown in just to get it to the track since I destroyed the side cover on my Evo rear diff during the tuning process as well. And the whole issue at this point was that the car spooled better than I ever could have possibly imagined. Going twin scroll, even on the same motor, had dropped spool over 1,000 RPMs despite upsizing the turbo on it. It would hit whatever boost I gave it under 3,500 RPMs. So even though it had pretty big cams in it with 3.6 liters and the really long intake manifold, it made so much torque that nothing behind the motor stood a chance. So I'd set up boost by RPM on my eBoost 2 with a completely linear curve in it, and I was just going to the track to send the winding transfer case to the moon in hopes that I'd get some idea of what the last 6 months of struggling with the car had accomplished. It was still uncaged. It was completely a street car. The only things that weren't present were air conditioning and airbags. Otherwise, it was super fat. It was 3,500 pounds with me in it that day. It was on the stock ECU that I tuned myself, and I was running these crappy Toyo TQ drag radials on the FDRX7 wheels that didn't hook for crap, but they were as tall a radial as I could get because every single time I went to the track, I would end up on the rev limiter in fourth before the traps. So naturally, it's a Sunday. It's the last event of the year at the Rock, and of course it had rained the night before. And anybody who went to the Rock back in the day remembers how notorious they were for slow track drying and terrible prep. So we'd gotten there super early, hoping to run while the air was still good, but instead we waited around for almost 8 hours. I actually drove the car up and down the track in a parade of cars to try to dry the track out. And by the time we were ready to run, it was mid-afternoon. It was hot. It was humid. It was basically not prepped, and I was super strung out. They also wanted to run a bracket series, which meant I got one qualifier. So I set my tires, I rolled up, and I winged that 10.2 at 137. On one hand, it was really awesome to run 10.2, but on the other hand, I was again sitting on the limiter before the traps. And as I checked peak boost as I rolled back to the pits, and I'd only reached 25.7 PSI instead of the 30 I'd tuned it at, and I didn't bring my laptop because I didn't want to stress the results. And I thought I could force myself into accepting them by denying myself the ability to do anything about it. Needless to say, I stressed the result.
Yeah.
So I was the only car there running faster than mid-11s, so I opted into an 11.5 bracket just so I could get a second pass. I aired my tires back down and added a couple percent to the top of the boost curve since I didn't have a data log, and I went back to the lanes. And the second pass was a 10.32 at 138 at 26.2 peak PSI. I had tried leaving just a little bit harder since it was really the only way I was going to knock any time off, but all I accomplished was knocking the tires off a little bit harder, and I lost that time in the 60-foot. So I'd broken out of my bracket, so that was it. I got 2 passes, and I took the car home and parted it out. I never drove it again.
Man, that's crazy.
It went out in a blaze of glory, man. It did not see much life in that state.
What made you what was the reasoning for parting it out afterwards?
I had something like 50,000 reasons to part it out. And by that I mean each one of those reasons came from $1 that I would have realistically had to have spent to put a serious dent in where it was at.
Yeah.
Starting with building a dual overhead cam engine for the sole purpose of raising my maximum trap speed, which is a huge undertaking. That meant a new piston program and a head program and a cam program and all the money and time associated with that, plus solving the jigsaw puzzle required to get the Mitsubishi-based dual overhead cam set up into a 3G, which is necessary because there's a lot of reasons you don't want to just go buy the Hyundai engine and work with that. I also had a single disc clutch in it with the synchrotrans, and shifting at 7,500 was already not glamorous. It didn't grind, but when you ripped the lever, you had to wait. And the single disc couldn't handle the torque I wanted to make anyway, so if you build the engine, now you got to get a custom twin disc clutch made because OTS options didn't exist back then. And ultimately a dog box was the next part of that equation. It already needed another transfer case, and I wasn't going to go back through that company again because that was just a huge, terrible fiasco. And it needed a rear differential as well. Really, to guarantee yourself any durability at that level, you're looking at a 3000 GT rear end swap.
Yeah.
A built one at that. And I just can't bring myself to do anything with that particular differential. I just can't do it. To cap all that off, I needed a standalone because I was on the stock ECU and I perpetually maxed out the mass airflow sensor, and I had done everything I could to raise that airflow ceiling and then even tuned past the ceiling. And it worked fine, but to put that much mechanical investment back into the car and not be able to turn the boost up, it would have required a standalone. And now I'm plugging, $40,000 worth of really nice race car stuff into what is ultimately sort of just a stock 3G. It was uncaged and had modified stock subframes in it, and it just wasn't type of car that you do that to.
Yeah.
And I guess the linchpin for me above all of that was just that it wasn't really that fun to drive.
Okay.
Not that it didn't punch you in the face when you mad at it, but it was totally drama-free. I'd done a very thorough suspension build on it in order to put that power down, and it did so without complaint. You could just about let go of the wheel and do a pass on a flat surface.
Wow.
It handled itself really, really well, but the ultimate issue is that at 3,500 pounds with me in it, that was enough inertia to just knock the edge off of pretty much any amount of power that I could have made with it. And I don't know if you've ever been in a Hellcat or a Camaro or something.
Yeah.
Even those cars, when they go really, really fast, at least to me, they're just not that fun. You can tell that they're heavy, and you can tell that weight's holding it back.
Yeah.
And I've driven a lot of cars and experienced a lot of cars out there, and the ones that stick out to me as the most fun are cars like the Volkswagen GTI or the Saturn Sky Redline, or a completely stock Evo with cams and E85 is up there. And what all those cars have in common is that they're punchy and light. They're sort of tossable, if you will. and that adds an edge to whatever they have to offer, even if it's total turd like a GTI. And that's what makes the cars fun. So I guess this is just it's a really long-winded way of saying that I had $50,000 worth of drivetrain and stuff to put into the car, but the chassis was the problem.
Gotcha.
So I parted it out, and of course, once I'd tried a couple other builds, that's when I realized that doing all the things I said I wouldn't do is what I wanted to do. I've told my friends I want to feel like I might die every time I push the pedal down.
Right, that's what makes it fun.
Exactly. So that's why the chassis part of the build was such a focal point, and how it sort of became what it is now.
So you think after all that, Justin, looking back on it, you would kind of go through that process all the same, or would you kind of do the chassis up and keep it all together when it ran that 10.2?
I've asked myself that question more times than anyone could probably imagine, and lost a lot of sleep over it. What I enjoy about this whole thing is the iterative engineering process. That's basically the basis of how my mind works. I'm constantly learning and applying the things I've learned, and measuring results and modifying and testing again. And this build is 5 years in the making. It's my 8th setup in the car. And it's the child of dozens of other builds that I've been a part of, and builds that I've carried out. At one point, not long after I'd parted the car out, I actually had an LS in it with a 4L80 and a Ford 8.8 IFS in the front. And I was going to do LS all-wheel drive. And the amount of weight that drivetrain added up to just made me sick. So I decided against that. And in lieu of the gear ratio problems that I always had, I made an adapter plate that adapted a 6G74 to the Audi Quattro trans, which comes with much taller gearing. And I put that in the car, and I made this custom rear end setup to go with it, and then decided against that. This is why when you see engine bay pictures of my car, that I cut the passenger side mount out of the body. It wasn't for weight reduction. It was because it wasn't useful for the longitudinal setups that I was at one point 100% committed to.
Oh, okay.
So after that, I decided to go back to the EVA route again. And I still built 3 different rear suspensions for the car before what I have in it now. And this all just comes from learning and trying and iterating. And I'm involved in a lot of non-3G builds. I had a Z06 that I went pretty deep in. I work on a lot of Volkswagens and Audis, and I have friends in pretty much every walk of motorsports life, and I've consulted on a number of setups across the board. And that has ultimately allowed me to test series and see how well things work out. And on top of that, I go to events like World Cup and keep tabs on what the fast guys are doing. That's a great way to learn about what needs to be done to go fast, walking through those pits and trying to stay out of their way when they're trying to fix something. But a lot of those cars get taken apart every single pass, and if you're there as it gets taken apart, you can learn a lot about what these guys are doing to go fast. And so I get all this information, and then in turn I update my plans and come up with another round of things that I need to try. So where it's at now and where it's going are perpetually moving targets. I could have built my car way faster if what I have now is the original plan, but this design is ultimately a result of all the places it's been. So I know there's a number of changes on the schedule. Some are already in process, but they're not that dramatic. I think the biggest thing for me at this point is the standalone, getting away from the stock ECU and adopting many of the features that make the cars like the RT Evos do what they do this day and age. You know, when I ran 10.2 with the Synchro Trans and the single disc, I drove it like a normal car. I let off the gas for each shift, and that alone causes it costs you a bunch of time. Yeah. So with the standalone, I no longer have the power ceiling due to the mass air sensor. I can fully take advantage of the dog box. Other than that, curb weight will be the biggest factor, so I'll continue to chip away at that. It's hard it's hard without the aftermarket support because the 3G doesn't have any.
Right.
But ultimately, the goal at this time, the goal with the build was to have nothing serious to go back and change with the chassis. No big fabrication projects. So it's been a success in that regard because the changes ahead will be pretty much bolt and go for the most part. So every build is a process, though, and because you can go to World Cup, none of these cars are done. Nobody cuts straight to the top, so I'm open-minded to whatever I have to do to keep getting faster.
Right. Got to keep making those fine-tuning adjustments.
Yes, sir.
So, Justin, with all that, you kind of talked about it a little bit, but what is it about this car that keeps you motivated to, like you said, keep throwing money at it, and to, you don't really have any competition at the top of the 3G list, and yet, you're going back out there and doing it again?
For me, it's my inherent drive. I'm in a competition with myself, ultimately pushing the boundaries of the engineering and seeing how far I can go with it. Is really what I'm in it for. As well as a high. I mean, I'd be a liar if I said there wasn't a high degree of sentimentality. From a very young age, my life has been a lot of work. I've always looked far ahead. When I was a kid, I was thinking about adulthood, and I knew what my major was going to be, and I was planning my career and looking at what my life would be like and taking aggressive steps to get there instead of goofing around and enjoying life like kids really should. This Eclipse and the things I've done with it and other cars constitute really the only thing that I've ever done just for the enjoyment of it. There isn't really any other reason for it behind it other than that. My personality drives me to learn and expand my knowledge. And the 3G Eclipse in particular offers this blank slate because nobody's done anything with the platform. And I could also afford to mess with it while paying for college. So I apply what I learn, I measure the results, I make it better, and I do it all again. And every time I do it with a 3G Eclipse, it does it unexpectedly well. And that just fuels the obsession that I have with this process. My Eclipse in particular has been the longest standing constant in my life. I've had the car, I would imagine by the time this podcast airs, I'll have had the car for over 14 years.
Wow.
And, it's pulled me through the darkest days of my life on every occasion.
Like, yeah.
I've parted it out like six times or so over the years, and every time push comes to shove, I put it back together. And this latest round, I've finally made peace with the fact that I always will put it back together no matter what happens.
Yeah, that's awesome. This episode of the MitsuTimes podcast is brought to you by Haltech. After 35 years in business, Haltech continues to be the industry leader in engine management and performance automotive electronics. Whether you're sliding sideways in a turbo drift car or pulling high gears in a 250-mile-an-hour Pro Mod, Haltech has you covered with their award-winning fuel and ignition control products. Their flagship Nexus R5 combines the functionality of a PDM, wideband controller, and engine management all in one state-of-the-art vehicle control unit. Powered by the user-friendly NSP software, Haltech gives you the ultimate control over your race car with Wi-Fi and built-in oscilloscope functionality. Haltech helps power the world's fastest 4G powered dragster, 4G all-wheel drive 5-speed, 4G all-wheel drive auto, and 4G front-wheel drive cars on the planet. Visit haltech.com for more information and find Haltech ECU on Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram. Haltech can help you unlock the power. So, Justin, you got to have some goals for next year now that you got it running. What do you have anything in mind? You want to get back to where you were, or you just want to? Is there a certain number or anything that you're really shooting for?
If I could choose one thing to accomplish next year, it would be to make a clean, full pass on 25 PSI or more.
Okay.
And, of course, the prerequisites for that include the standalone and the other odds and ends, as well as getting licensed. And I say 25 PSI simply because that is where it was at before. And it'll be fun to get that direct comparison and see what all the other differences in the car have added up to. Also, I don't think that 25 PSI will make enough power to necessarily destroy anything, and I'm not really in a rush to start that whole cycle.
Yeah.
I think it should handle probably up to 1,000 without any major problems, but once I start revving over 8,500 and pushing 30 plus, the learning is going to start again, and I want to get some baseline data and a few revisions, and the purpose of the build is to go rounds at the track events, so making enough horsepower to do that is sort of low on the to-do list right now. Getting the suspension to work and the strain gauge dialed and all that stuff is way more important, and they're really the parts of this process that I've looked forward to the most. So yeah, I think get a pass in that gives me an idea of how well this all worked out is what I'm after, not necessarily its absolute best time.
Yeah, that makes sense. Do you have any long-term goals, Justin? Maybe not. For 2023, like you said, you're just trying to get it out there and get everything working and getting it lined out. Is there any kind of long-term goal? You want to break your old record, or you want to be the first 3G in the nines?
Well, tentatively, the ultimate goal is to run a 7-second pass.
Okay. Heck yeah.
Every decision I made with the car was with respect to that. So being a 3G, there are certain handicaps that I can't do anything about, like the lightweight body panels. But within the confines of it being a 3G Eclipse and having a 6G7 engine in it, I spared nothing to the ends of trying to run a 7-second pass. And it's definitely a long-term goal. It'll be a process if it ever happens. And at this point, I don't necessarily even think of it in terms of a goal or of what I'd call a design parameter. Because running sevens, you look on YouTube these days and it looks super easy, but running sevens is truly a mountain.
Oh, for sure.
And I'm just a guy. I'm just a guy who works a regular job and throws wrenches in his garage.
Not a shop.
Ultimately, that's what I'd like to accomplish. And beyond that, whether I accomplish that or not, I think the number one thing that I really want to do is to go racing. Like actually racing, not just to test and tune.
Right.
Bigger little events doesn't really matter, but just to be out there, to be part of the community again, to feel the competition adrenaline, smell the smells, and be one of those cars that rolls up to the line that brings people to their feet.
For sure.
That is ultimately what I want.
Be the first 3G to qualify for World Cup.
Ooh, that'd be pretty wild.
That would. Nobody would expect that.
No, there'd be some double takes on that one for sure.
So, Justin, have you had any other Mitsubishis in your life that have, kind of either kept you coming back to this 3G or motivated you to, come back and build it?
Well, I have never owned any other Mitsubishi, although I've wrenched on enough of them to feel like I own them.
Right.
And I've had so many 3Gs now, I can't actually remember. I'd have to sit down and look back on it to figure out how many of these things I've owned now. Currently, I only have the one, and I tell myself I can't get another one, but I'd really like to. It's the 6G7, and I guess like I mentioned, the blank slate underdog mantra of the car that really brings me back to it.
I definitely understand that.
I've had a number of non-Mitsubishi project cars, and for one reason or another, none of them ever end up finding their way to completion, and usually it's because I get distracted for a little while and then realize that I need to focus on the Eclipse again to try to keep it moving.
So, Justin, if somebody out there, they're listening, they think, they're listening to the internet that their 3G is not capable of being a serious drag racing car, what advice would you give them to, kind of start their build or, where to get started?
Well, The first thing I would tell anybody who feels some type of way about what they read online is to forget social media. The next thing I'd tell them is take anything you read on the forum with a grain of salt. And the next thing I would tell them is to start small. I cannot tell you how many 3G builds I've seen fail over the years, and they all fail for one of a very short list of reasons. The number one reason above all is that they end up biting off more than they can chew.
Yep.
And that usually looks like doing forced induction and an engine swap at the same time. They usually try this when they've never done anything else like it to any car at all. They go and buy whatever motor Instagram's talking about at the time, find a bunch of used boost parts, and realize they don't know how to swap the motor, or they don't have a place to do it, and so it takes a long time for them to get that done, and they're getting impatient and they start putting boost parts on it before it even runs, or they start figuring out that they missed 80% of the actual supporting mods they need. And once in a while they get it all together and they come to me asking about tunes, and I tell them they got a bunch of stuff in there that won't work, and they don't want to listen because they have so much money and work into doing it wrong, and it never ends up running, and they forget how to return it to stock, and they end up selling all their parts to the next guys who's doing the same thing.
Right.
So you got to do yourself a favor. Forget the social media hype. Don't go buy a Mivec motor. Cover the basics before anything else. Get that limited slip differential. Get it installed with a tranny refresh and a shifter system upgrade, because there's no point in doing anything if you can't drive the car. Get a nice balanced clutch kit and flywheel combo that is set up for whatever you eventually plan to do to the car, and get a proper urethane engine mount set up. Go through your suspension and deal with your rusted hardware. Get the urethane in there. Get rid of every rubber bushing on the car. Get it properly aligned at a modest ride height that won't destroy your axles, and put a timing belt on your motor. Then bolt on your stock motor. And the most important thing that 3Gers seem to forget is that they need to build a relationship with their tuner. Because without that, you can't do anything.
Yeah.
So once a guy's crossed all those bridges, they've learned enough to do what they need to do to accomplish the other things they want to accomplish on the platform, then they'll have the resources to support them. If you want a good, rewarding street car, my recommendation is always to put a 6G75 non-Mivec in it. There's no more fun you can have behind the wheel of one of these cars than with a non-Mivec in it. And if you really, really want to trade all your street abilities so you can go fast above highway speeds, boost the stock motor. A completely stock 6G72 with a good boost setup will destroy anything front-wheel drive on the current 3G list, if it's set up to hook and driven well.
Yeah.
And I guess since I have the opportunity, I got to throw one plug in here real quick. If you're a 3G V6 guy out there and you have a 6G72 throttle body on your 6G74 intake manifold, you got a vacuum leak. I can't even tell you how many times I've been seeing this lately. And it's hilarious because the forum says that you can do this, but if you hold up a stock throttle body gasket to that manifold, you'll see that there's no material for it to seal on.
Ah.
And the irony is that manifold, it's not even an upgrade anyway unless it's ported. So unless these guys are going to have that done, it's just not worth it. And there's better things to do.
Mm-hmm.
And then it's all just part of the way it goes. The forum's perpetuated this nonsense for over 20 years now. But, it falls in line with what I said earlier about why the 3G never took off as a platform. There's no how-to for the car.
Right.
And everything written about it is wrong. You got to learn and think on your feet to be successful with it. And that separates it from a lot of other platforms out there.
Yeah. So, Justin, we've talked about a lot of the weaknesses of the 3G. I don't want to discourage anybody who has a 3G out there. So let's talk about the strengths of the 3G. Obviously, the 6G72 or the V6 engine, like you said, is a very good starting point.
Yeah, so to me, the greatest strength of the 3G is the experience that you can't get anywhere else in the automotive world. There isn't another platform out there that offers a torquey, responsive manual V6 in a reasonably light car. It's a dinosaur. It's a lumber wagon. It's not refined, but it is these things in the best way. What sucks is that it's not quite this thing in stock form. The biggest beef I have with the whole entire car is the bubblegum engine mounts from the factory. They destroy even the factory showroom level experience of the car. But they're cheap and easy to upgrade. And if you take a completely stock GT and upgrade the engine mounts with a good set, put some shifter cable end bushings in it, and rebuild the shift linkage, because pretty much all of them need it at this point, it's a completely different car. It follows commands instantaneously. It's got a cable-driven throttle body, and it makes really great noises while it does it if you know what to do with the exhaust. From an engineering standpoint, the 3G is what I call a very cheap, big hardware car. And what I mean by that is if you go walk around a junkyard and you look under the hood and underneath every vehicle, and then you go look at the 3G, you'll notice that everything in the 3G is pretty large. The engine, the transmissions, the axles, the hubs, the spindles, and so on and so forth. It's sort of a slab of beef. And if you take care of the one Achilles heel it has, you can make more power on more stock parts than most other platforms out there. If you want to go way further than that, the engines have cast iron blocks. They have girdled main caps. The V6s come with M12 head bolts from the factory. These are things that the biggest tuning platforms that exist, that are so famous for going fast, famous for being easy to make go fast, those guys pay huge amounts of money to have these things that 3G has from the factory. My 10.2 setup, for instance, that motor lives on today, there's a $27 set of Victor Reinz head bolts in that thing, and factory head gaskets. You don't need to reinvent the wheel with this thing. It's been beaten on for nearly a decade, and it has never pushed a single drop of coolant. The forged crankshafts in these things handle pretty much anything you can throw at them. They come with 8-bolt flywheel hubs, so the flywheels don't fall off like they do on some other platforms. I could go on. And I guess the most concise way to say it is that the 3G truly is a Mitsubishi. It's not technologically advanced, it's not luxurious, but it is built to withstand rally-raising levels of abuse despite the fact that it's a production highway car. The difference is that this Mitsubishi just needs a bit more from the owner to put out like all the others.
Yeah. That's awesome. So there you go. We need to get some more 3Gs out there racing, and
yes, we do.
Now you don't have an excuse not to do it.
Oh yeah.
So Justin, I like to always talk hypothetical with people. Do you see any movements coming up in the top 10 of the 3G list of, maybe some shakers and movers? I know. I think it was Boston Hatcher sold his car.
There ain't many people left, man.
Yeah. I don't know if Joey Miller's still racing anymore. I know he just bought another one, but I'm not sure what his plan is with it.
Yeah, well, if my experience has anything, indicates anything, it's that anything can happen.
Yeah, that's true.
So, when it comes to the list and the top 10 and the top 20 and so on, the 3G community has a pretty serious obsession with it. And who's going to move and what times will be broken. I think that basically what I'm getting at is I think this will probably be the part of the podcast they're most interested in.
Uh-huh.
So I would like to break this down a little bit more in depth. I know I love to talk a lot, but if you'll bear with me,
Absolutely.
I'll sort of line it out.
I love it.
Obviously, I intend to go way faster, right?
Yep.
And
you have the tools and the means.
Right. And the time is in and the car's done, and that's an obvious next step. I think that the one other car that has a shot at really moving on the list in the near future is Matt's Galant. His car is a couple iterations on my last setup, and it's more of a race car build as opposed to the street car build that I had before.
Yeah.
And so realistically speaking, it should be very capable of going faster. But to be completely honest with you, other than that, I don't really see a whole lot changing.
You think Ben will crack into the top 10?
Well, I'm not saying it's impossible.
He's not too far.
And I think the overall goal, of the community is to run 9s.
Yeah.
And to me, having been through these cars the way that I have, there's a few different ways that could happen. And so the cheapest and probably the easiest way to do it, and most people's jaws will drop when I say this, but is with a front-wheel drive V6 auto setup. The problem with the W5A that comes in the 3G is that it is absolutely nothing like the W4A33s of the past. The internals are puny. They're made of pot metal. It runs wickedly low line pressures, and it has individual mechanical closed-loop feedback pressure control on every application in the trans. The stock electronics are absolutely garbage and run on extremely tight operational tolerances that are simply impossible to maintain if you deviate from stock. It doesn't tolerate torque, shock loads. There's no blue wire mod for it, and it gets hot. So how would you do this with an auto, right? Well, the first thing that you have to do is take control of the trans away from the stock electronics. And this is actually really easy to do. The entire control layout is available in the FSM, which is on Club 3G. You can just go look it up. Actually taking control of the trans costs you almost nothing. And then you get a 6-bolt torque converter with a flex plate and have it restalled at precision for less than the cost of your average clutch. And stick a big cooler on it with some nice fluid, and at that point, it's everything else that matters. So with the type of chassis build required to run 9s, a set of 10.5-inch wrinkle walls are going to hook way more than that transmission can handle. So you don't need all-wheel drive. You can save the drivetrain loss. You can save the 250 pounds, and you really should, because you're going to need to. And this is how to run 9s in a 3G, not have a fun street car. So get as much weight out of the car as you can. Build a really good turbo setup that spools quick and makes good power out the back, but limit the torque. And this way you can leave under power, easily cut the best 60-foot any 3G has ever cut without even having to worry about your stock axles. And you can send that power out the back because the gearing is so tall that you have headroom for big trap speed. Now, I'm not sure if the trans really is robust enough to run 9s in a 3G. That's going to be super curb weight contingent. Maybe low 10s, but it'll be close. And this is a build that I've wanted to try this for forever.
I was going to say, it sounds like you already got it done in your head.
Yeah. The problem is, literally every time I go and pick up one of these transmissions, I'm like, nope. Because they're heavy, man. They're just giant, heavy transmissions. And I'm like, oh my God, you're telling me this performs... God, I just can't do it.
Is there not a W4 situation that would work in there?
Well, the whole deal with the 3G is that since it is not a DSM, the engine is on the other side of the engine bay. So the W4A33, which did come in the 3000 GTs, I know there's that Myvec swapped 1G that's running the W4A33 in it front wheel. And the 3000 GTs overseas, the Mitsubishi GTOs actually came with a W4A33 all-wheel drive that bolts up to the V6.
Yeah. We see a lot of Stealth and 3000 GT race cars using those.
Yep. So the whole problem is that it's on the opposite side of the bay.
Gotcha.
And I actually at one point with my car planned on putting the 5-speed from the 3000 GT VR4 in my car because it has some of the tallest gear ratios that have ever been offered in any vehicle ever. And it would have solved my sitting on the limiter and fourth issue, but you dig into those transmissions a little bit, you find out really quick that the single cone synchros and 9,000 RPMs don't get along very well. But it's because it's on the other side of the bay that it's not really a swap. You could do it, but putting that in a 3G would be a pretty intense fabrication project for somebody.
Gotcha.
So Instead, the community seems to be most obsessed with doing it the absolute hardest and most expensive way,
Yep.
which is with the manual V6 all-wheel drive setup. And I know that there was this group buy. A bunch of guys got together and bought an adapter plate. And I heard about this because a few of them came to me asking about the design, because it requires you to cut the front lower mounting boss out of the Evo bell housing. And they do this because they want to keep the starter in the Eclipse location and only run one engine mount on the back of the trans in order to avoid modifying the oil pan to fit the starter in the Evo location. Now, first of all, destroying a transmission that is now going for $1,500+ in stock form in order to save cutting a $40 oil pan and a little bit of aluminum welding is insanity. And that's just insane.
Yeah.
On top of that, no tranny builder is going to touch a transmission that has a big hole in the bell housing. So now you're stuck getting it built first, because in order to make it, to make power with one of these things, you're going to have to get that trans built. So now you're getting your trans built, and you're going to destroy a $4,000 or $5,000 transmission. And if that isn't enough, just from an engineering standpoint, that transmission will simply never handle the shock loads and torque loads that come with running 9s in a stick shift car. And I hope that for their sake, whoever finally goes and launches one of these things under power with good tires on a prep surface finds that the bosses for the rear mount fail before the bell housing cracks, because then they only destroy their entire drivetrain, whereas if that bell housing fails, they may very well end up with a pressure plate coming through the firewall.
Yeah.
And that's a really bad deal.
For sure.
So realistically, to do it this way, a new plate needs to be made. Another issue that a lot of these guys have is that they're planning on using an Evo 6 transfer case. And they want to do that because it's an under subframe setup, and it doesn't require changing the 3G front subframe or the floor pan. And the problem with that transfer case is that there's a 17 millimeter neck point in the pinion, and guys have been breaking those off at bolt-on 4-cylinder horsepower levels and far lighter cars overseas since long before the 3G was even a concept. So Magnus makes a ring and pinion for it, but you're talking about a $5,000 transfer case all said and done. So it's possible, but to me, it pales in comparison to just using a domestic transfer case in the first place, and even that needs to be built. And even when you build it, you might break it. In fact, chances are you're going to break it eventually. Ask me how I know.
Right.
And deploying that unit requires a bunch of work with the subframe and the floor pan. So if none of that's enough, I'm not even going to talk about the rear differential. Instead, let's just say that the mechanical integrity of the manual all-wheel drive V6 setup is addressed. As I've talked about earlier, the big issue waiting for these guys then becomes gearing. The Evo gearing is extremely short. I had the tallest final drive, the tallest fourth gear, the tallest tires, and the highest rev limiter used on a 3G V6 ever at the time, and I still hit the limiter well before the traps. So what are these guys going to do? Getting a single overhead cam motors to rev, it's a problem. I had custom cams that were designed specifically to be easy on the rockers, and my stiffest valve spring combo in that motor, which is substantially stronger than simply throwing the Mustang valve springs in it, which is what a lot of guys are doing now. Mm-hmm. And the rockers start to have issues at 7,700 RPM because they're these big, giant cast aluminum hammer-shaped things that they're heavy. And that limit has been consistent with the same spring combo in the Mivec motors, which while they can breathe up high on stock cams, they also have their own list of issues. And this isn't to say that money can't buy a taller final drive now or a taller fourth gear, that a stronger valve spring setup couldn't be implemented on a better cam profile that hasn't been developed yet, or that the car couldn't be lighter than mine, which while it was a heavy pig, it was pretty well optimized for a street car. I guess what I'm saying is that improving on everything enough to go faster is a big task. But if you want to run 9s in a 3G, that's how you're going to do it. And in reality, if you want to run 10s in a 3G or low 11s in a 3G, these are considerations that you're going to have to make if you have if you're trying to do it with a manual V6 all-wheel drive.
Yeah.
And all of these considerations, of course, are what we've done with Matt's Galant. So we've, improved a few things in the engine, and it's going to have a better turbo kit, and a little bit more gear, and a little less curb weight. And all these little things are like that last 5% deal. It's expensive and time consuming. And even in the end, if it does beat my time, it won't be by some huge earth shattering margin. There just isn't a whole lot of meat left on the bone unless you're going to go full race car.
Yeah.
Build a dual overhead cam motor and put a dog box, which of course is what I did with mine. And you can see that natural progression.
Okay.
The easiest way to do it, and in my opinion, the best way to do it for anybody with a 3G who wants to go fast, and it sort of goes against my my mantra to say this, but is to use the 4-cylinder car. Like I said earlier, the 4-cylinder 3G transmissions are completely unviable, so it'll never happen unless you convert to all-wheel drive. But all-wheel drive is much easier to accomplish with the 4-cylinder chassis.
Yeah.
And if you use the domestic transfer case and especially if you pay attention to your drive shaft geometry, you end up with something that's, it becomes just any other 4G63 all-wheel drive manual platform that Mitsubishi's famous for. And honestly, it might even be the best chassis combination possible, considering what's been accomplished on the 2G rear suspension and unibody.
Yeah.
Because the 3G is just it's shaped a little bit differently, but it's really just a 2G Eclipse with a different motor in it, and then it has a more robust, strut-based front suspension setup. So you put those two together, you might really be in business. The 4-cylinders, because they don't have that big boat anchor V6, they're lighter, they're easier to keep light. You can keep your air conditioning with your turbo setup and not overheat the crap out of it. And obviously there's more than enough awesome street combos available for the 4G6 platform that would absolutely destroy 10.2, even in a full weight car. Someone just has to do it. And maybe they will. But to get back to what I originally said, I'm not liking the odds, because transmissions are $1,500.
Right.
Transfer cases are $2,000. Like with the amount of money that it costs to build one of these things now, man, if I could afford that, why would I start with a 3G? It would still be cheaper to just go buy an Evo shell.
Yeah, for sure.
So it's a hard deal. And like I said, everybody's parting out. Everybody's had problems and they're moving on, and it bums me out because I'd love to see more of these cars going fast. And you and I both know that 10.2 in the scheme of things really isn't that fast.
That's fair.
For me, it was really hard taking 5 years off. And while my personal life was the main driving factor behind that, my biggest regret at this point is I could have enjoyed so much of that time taking baby steps in the right direction as opposed to one giant leap.
Yeah.
And being, a part of what is ultimately the platform's final gasp. At this point, there's like 2 or 3 people out there who are, who aren't affiliated with me, who are doing something. So, that it sucks. And I'm back, and now everybody's gone, but I'm here to push myself on the boundaries of the engineering. And I get just as excited about other people's builds as I do mine, as long as their motivations are in the right place. Unfortunately, I think that social media has tainted the automotive community, and it's made it especially hard for platforms like the 3G. But for anybody out there listening with a 3G Eclipse, if you want to go faster, whether it's putting together the most enjoyable street car possible or trying to go racing, feel free to hit me up on Instagram, man. I'm here to help.
I just had a guy hit me on TikTok this morning saying that he has a 4-cylinder 3G and wants to get in the up on the list, and he doesn't know where to start.
Well, feel free to point him in Zulfab's direction, man.
I will. I told him I'm not the man to ask, but I think I know the man to ask. So, Justin, is there any events that we can come out and see your car in action? Well, I guess this will be aired this year still. So, is there any events next year that we'll be able to go out and see your car in action?
Well, let's just say I sure hope so. Obviously, it's contingent on how it goes. The break-in on the car was just a taste, and while I got a ton of data from it, until I really start to turn it up, especially coming fresh in with a standalone, I don't know how it's going to work.
Yeah.
There's some local events that I'd really like to get to. Minnesota has a pretty big Mitsubishi community, and
you can
they
tell
all
that just from the 3G list.
Yeah, and there's some fast Evos and DSMs here too. I know you talked to Mark Leisure.
Yep.
Most of those guys attend proving grounds, so I've attended proving grounds a number of times just as a spectator, and you know how it goes when you're just a random guy without a car and you walk up in the pits. You're sort of a nobody. So I'd like to get my car out there, not just to make passes, and also so that I can break the ice with these guys and start getting to know them a little bit and make some new connections. So I think the big local event would be proving grounds. The premier event, realistically, would be the shootout. I've wanted to go for a long time, and it's if you've never gone to the shootout, it's hard to find information about it.
It's like they keep it secret or something. It's so weird.
Yeah, I'm like, where's the sign-up list? What class can I enter? What do you guys require for me from safety equipment?
Because it's all on Facebook, and I don't understand that.
Yeah, so one way or another, I'll get it figured out here, and if the shootout's late in the year, so I have the most time to sort the car, all things considered. So
they just released the date, so.
Yeah, I saw that. There's like 290 some odd days until that comes back. So that would be the big event that I want to get to. It's the closest event to me since Streetcar Takeover quit going to Great Lakes, which is what stick shift racing and Streetcar Takeover was what I'd originally wanted to do with the car, and then they quit going to Great Lakes like a month after I decided that's what I wanted to do.
Go figure.
So whatever. Ohio's still a hike, but that'd be worth making the trip for.
Definitely. We'd love to have you.
Yeah, so my pipe dream, of course, would be World Cup. But unless they split out like a no assist type stick shift class, I probably will never even be fast enough to register for that event, since now you need to be deep into the sevens just to register for stick shift.
I think Mean Street's going to stay in the 8-9s.
That would be great if I had stock floors in my car.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So I'm 6'3". I'm a really big guy, especially with a helmet on, and I literally don't fit in a 3G.
Gotcha.
Legally under a cage. So when I did my cage, I ended up having to cut the floor out and move everything down a little bit. So. Okay. It's the floor I have in it's heavier than stock. It's no advantage, but that classes me pretty much into outlaw stick shift land. And unfortunately, these slipper clutch guys and these computer controlled launch devices have sort of screwed up my chances of getting there. So as much as I'd like to go to World Cup, chances are slim. So
once you get the Haltech figured out, I think you'll be in there.
Yeah, it's all contingent on how well it works, and we're going to find out, of course. So, other than that, keep an eye on the Rock Falls schedule for Sport Compact days. Like I said, the prep's never great at the Sport Compact days, but above all else, to get to the track with some of my buddies again, with a grill and some hot dogs would be the fairy tale cherry on top at this point. So.
Definitely.
That's sort of what's in store for 2023.
I love it. Well, Justin, where can you talked about your Instagram? Is there anywhere else where people can hit you up or follow your build and be able to see your car in action on the internet?
I don't really do much with social media.
Gotcha.
It took a long time just to get the Instagram and start using the Instagram. So that's really the only place that you can find me.
So Zulfab on Instagram.
Zulfab on Instagram, and then if you happen to be on Club 3G, the old forum, I do sign into there once in a while and field some questions and page through, recent posts and look for more interesting questions that get asked. And once in a while, I'll offer some input on there. So if you hit me up on Club 3G, eventually you'll get a response. I'm one of those people who doesn't have a single unread message or email on any platform that he's a part of. And part of that means not having a whole lot of platforms, but chances are if you reach out, you'll get a response. So, feel free to hit me up.
Love that. So, Justin, is there anybody that you want to give a shout out to for, helping get your car where it is and to, kind of helping you along the road?
For sure, yeah. First shout out would be to my best friend, Matt, a.k.a. Emrod, owner of the Ghost, which is the white 8G Galant. I don't know exactly where it is on the list, but it's there somewhere in the bottom 12.
Number 6 right now.
Yeah, so his car is the all-wheel drive manual V6 Monster in progress that we're working towards seeing on the road next spring. And Matt and I have been friends for over a decade now. I think we're coming up on 12 or so years. And he's supported me through every step of this process. Honestly, as I'm sure you can imagine, the patience required to listen to me yammer on as much as I do for as long as he has is up there with the absolute goats. The number of times I've switched directions, and most people would just tell me off for constantly changing my plans. Ben Denk is another one you can ask about how often I waffle on things because I'm just trying to figure out what that absolute best option is. But Matt has truly championed that role, and I'm truly grateful for that. He'll drop anything and come get me out of a pinch. So great thanks to him, and really looking forward to being out racing with him next year. The other person I'll shout out here, and there's a good chance he'll never hear this podcast, but I'll do it anyway, is my other good friend Levi. He is the owner of the fastest 270 B5 S4, and I'll say it's soon to be the fastest B5 S4 that has ever existed. That's an Audi for you Mitsubishi people. Levi is the only other human I've ever met who mirrors my obsession with this iterative race car building process. Actually, I met both of these guys street racing and became friends with them. And Levi's car may very well always be faster than mine. He is a master mechanic and a talented fabricator who's taught me a lot, done me some real solids. He's actually the one who assembled the 8.8 that's in my car. And Levi always keeps me on my toes as a human being. And everybody needs a friend like that. I'd be lost without both of these guys, and if I ever do get to make it to a big event, they'll be the ones tossing wrenches in the pits and lining me up for staging. So, I've met a lot of great people over the years through 3Gs and racing, and that's ultimately been the best part. So, going fast is one of those things you can't do alone, and I look forward to rolling with these guys next year as well as the many new faces I'm going to meet.
Heck yeah. All right, Justin. Well, I appreciate you coming on and taking time to tell your story. I love.
Yeah, man. Thanks for having me.
I hope to eventually get all the number ones on here at one point. So I'm glad that we got a chance to do this. And
you've got your work cut out for you.
Yeah, for sure. The thing that would be the best outcome for me for this podcast would be to get some more people motivated to get their 3Gs out to the track and
Heck
to
yeah,
get them
man.
on the list.
I am all about it. Let's get it done.
Absolutely. Well, Justin, thanks again, and I hope to see an update from you soon.
Yeah, it'll once deer season then here, I'll be back in the garage.
There you go. All right, well, have a good one, and like I said, we're looking for that 9-second slip here once it gets warm up there.
Sounds great, man. I'll be ready.
All right.
Thank you for listening to the MitsuTimes podcast. Check out our Instagram and Facebook for daily updates. Get added to our list by going to MitsuTimes.org and clicking Submit a Slip. Thank you to all of our sponsors.